theory is put into practice. Research ethics as praxis. This is the first of 3 webinars this spring and summer hosted by Community-Based Research Canada. My name is Jana Martin, and I am the CBRC Secretariat Support Person, and I will be the moderator for today's session. Community-Based Research Canada's mission is to address real societal problems through research as a national champion and facilitator for community-based research and campus community engagement in Canada. For 10 years, CBRC has brought together key players of community campus partnerships. Our network builds capacity for academic and broader communities to collaborate and use research as a tool to mobilize community participation and action. We would love to hear from you during this webinar. Please share your comments and questions in the chat box during or after the presentation. I will share your questions with the presenter during the Q&A period, which will take place in the last 15 minutes of this webinar. I am pleased to introduce today's presenter, Ryan Huckle. Ryan is the chair of the Community Research Ethics Office Board, where he has been reviewing community projects for the last 5 years. He also serves as the ethicist for Conestoga College Research Ethics Board and works in Conestoga's School of Engineering as the Graduate Attributes Quality Assurance Coordinator. Ryan's varied experience includes graduate studies in the ethics of first aid and rescue, data collection in OLG casinos for UW's Gambling Research Lab, project work with KW's Community Foundation, and volunteer work for nonprofits in the Waterloo region. I'm excited to welcome Ryan, and it will just be a minute for the transition to happen. Hey, Ryan.
Hello.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Hello, everyone. Is the sound good on your side? I can still adjust my microphone a little bit.
It sounds good to me. And if anyone has difficulty seeing or hearing, they can just comment. Thanks, Matthew.
Yes, thank you, Matthew. All right, then, shall we begin? I guess that in that case, I'll take over, Jana.
That would be great.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you very much for the introduction, Jana. As she said, my name is Ryan Huckle. I am the chair of the Community Research Ethics Office based out of Waterloo. And today I want to talk to you about research ethics as praxis. Now, that's a little bit of a big, fancy, technical, philosophical term, but what I want to focus on today is how do we think about research ethics and how do we build it into our research projects from a foundational level? And so I want to share some of our experiences with the Community Research Ethics Office and identify some stumbling blocks that some of our applicants experience when they're going through the ethics approval process. First of all, I just want to give a special thank you to 2 of our board members, Daniela and Leah, for their contributions to this webinar. And of course, if you want to find out more information about us, you can always visit our website at communityresearchethics.com. And then as well, for today, I have included a PDF of this slide deck on our website, communityresearchethics.com/resources/presentations. Some of the presentation slides that I have today do have embedded links, and so that will allow you to click on for further information. And as well, as I was preparing for this presentation, I discovered that there's perhaps a bit more I could have added in terms of context or some resources. So I will update the PDF slide on our website. And so afterwards, when you're reviewing the webinar video, you can always look at the PDF and have those clickable links as well as any additional information that I include. So, what are we going to talk about today? I want to focus a little bit of a high-level discussion on what research ethics is in general. This presentation does presuppose a little bit of an intermediate level of understanding. If you've never encountered research ethics before, I've tried to ensure that this presentation is accessible to you. But this does start with a framework that you are conducting research or you have conducted research. And so I want to talk about the foundational guiding principles that we use when we review ethics applications at our board. And then from those guiding principles, I want to discuss 5 common stumbling blocks that we find. If you follow the guiding principles, you will probably get about 80 to 90% of the way there in terms of thinking through the ethical problems in the study. But these common stumbling blocks are often things that are overlooked or not considered from the outset. And so I want to share those experiences with you and then open things up to a question period. Now, as much as we can have a show of digital hands, within the chat window down below, let me know first, who here has their TCPS certification? Do we have anybody here who indeed has gone through the certification process online? Yes, I should also say that this presentation does presuppose a Canadian context. I hope that enough of the information is translatable across different domains, but I do apologize for this being a bit of a Canadian themed presentation. Okay, we do have a few. How about our second question? Who in the audience has filled out an ethics application? And I mean any ethics application, even if it's not with the Community Research Ethics Office. All right, so we do have a few. I apologize, my boss is trying to call me. That's okay. All right, and finally, who in the audience, if anyone, has never run a study before? So never filled out an application, never run a study. This is your first time. You're here purely for informational purposes. Yay, we do have at least one person. So I hope that this presentation will give a little bit of information to everyone, whether or not you've never run a study before or you are a seasoned vet when it comes to running studies in your community and thinking through these detailed, technical, philosophical, ethical issues. So, okay, what is research ethics at a high level? Now, when we think about research ethics, and when I try to teach it to students or teach it to new board members, I often like to think about the context of research and history. Research ethics as a domain is still a relatively recent, a relatively young field, but the idea of professional obligations certainly goes back quite far in history, from medical ethics and builders and architects. But the modern understanding of research ethics certainly has progressed through a number of key events. And if you really want to pinpoint perhaps the start of our modern understanding of research ethics, you would probably start with World War II and the codes that came out of the Nuremberg trials. And so from Nuremberg, we started to develop understandings of the informed consent process and what is required if you are going to get participants into your study, and what are the obligations that you have as a researcher when you're trying to conduct your research. But as I said, in a historical context, the development of research ethics really tends to be a study of these key events and a number of issues that occurred with them. So after Nuremberg, you had things like the Tuskegee syphilis study, and the idea of whether or not we want to take serious, and this happened through the Belmont report, the idea of the risk and benefit calculus, and what kinds of studies are we willing to tolerate, and what kinds of advances or what kind of benefits that we want to get from research come at too high of a cost to our participants. There are, of course, other more contemporary issues. I mean, there are plenty of pharmacy issues with prescribing of medications and conflicts of interest. You look at how technology has advanced with things like Cambridge Analytica and user profiling. Recently in Canada, with the legalization of cannabis, you certainly have many questions arising in terms of how cannabis is going to be adjudicated in ethics. In Colorado, they recently passed a decriminalization of certain kind of psychedelics. Now, especially with machine learning and systemic biases in coding, you run into problems there. And even as early as the last few weeks, you've seen news reports about corporate interests, say like Coca-Cola, burying unfavorable research. And so when it comes to research and when it comes to ethics, we really think about it in terms of the research, humans, and justice. And for the purposes of CREO, for the purposes of the research I'm about to talk about, it really is going to center itself around humans. We follow the Tri-Council's policy statement on the conduct of research concerning human participants. So this presentation doesn't address things like environmental ethics or resource management or policy related to those kinds of topics. But if we are asking ourselves, what is research ethics? Ultimately, it comes down to a concern about the moral and ethical conduct involved in carrying out research, which includes both the integrity of the research practice as well as the welfare of the subjects. And so its aim ultimately is to protect the human subjects and ensure that the interests of the subjects are considered and examined for ethical and moral questions, the ethical soundness of the research activities. So really that's where we get that intersection between humans and justice. It's reviewing the research process to ensure that the people that give of themselves for the study are going to benefit from that, and that we aren't just thinking about research purely in terms of a dispassionate progress towards understanding the world that we find ourselves in. Now, how this gets operationalized typically is the REB, or the Research Ethics Board, where they use the policy framework to adjudicate studies. The researchers fill out the applications and send them into the ethics board, and they conduct what is known as a proportionate response. And that idea is, we understand that research and discovering the unknown comes with a certain element of risk. We cannot learn new things about the world that we find ourselves in without also taking on an amount of risk. And so the idea is, as best as we can, think about the balance of risk and benefit that comes with the research. And how do we mitigate that risk? And how do we think through it? And whether or not we're going to allow certain kind of risks to be permissible, whether or not they are considered extraordinary risks. And so ultimately, what's important in this process is making sure that research and researchers are accountable, that we are seeking to build trust, that we're seeking to build collaborations, that we're promoting justice, that the research itself is useful to everyone and that everyone can benefit from it. And ultimately, the bottom line will be that it protects the integrity of the science itself. So within this research framework, we do have some guiding principles that we use to think through this. The TCPS gives us three main principles: the respect for persons, the concern for welfare, and a concern for justice. And then we at the Community Research Ethics Office also pay special attention to a respect for the community. I'll go through these at a high level. And as I said at the top of the presentation, if you follow these guiding principles, you're going to get 80 to 90% of the way there. You're going to cover the majority of the cases. But in some of these, when you start to look at the details and the nitty-gritties of it, you're going to find that there are things that you may not have considered, these stumbling blocks that they can be anticipated, but oftentimes well-intentioned researchers just it's an oversight on their part. We often start from a position that researchers are good people, that you don't mean to cause harm. You're not intentionally trying to cause harm. But sometimes the things that we do have impacts on the world that we didn't anticipate. And so part of the collaboration between the researcher and the research ethics board is to suss out some of those unintended consequences and try to mitigate them before the study begins. So if we're thinking about respect for persons, ultimately it comes down to items like free and informed consent, where the researchers will inform the participants in as clear a language as they can what they will be asked to do. The researcher will communicate the risks and the benefits of participating in the study, how the information that they collect from the research participants will be used, what their rights as a participant are, etc. So this is your standard boilerplate information letter material. But also built into the idea of respect for persons is the idea of autonomy and voluntariness, that potential participants understand that they have a choice of how or if their data will be used without any negative consequence. Usually this is thought of in terms of you can decline to answer questions or you can withdraw from the study without any penalty to yourself. But it respects that a person has the ability to consent for themselves as well as withdraw that consent at any point in the study. And the final bit under respect for persons is this idea of vulnerability, that all people, regardless of their capacity, will be fully informed directly or through an authorized other person to make decisions on their behalf. So this often is where we look at the ability to consent, the capacity to consent, the mental capacity of the person, whether there's any kind of mental cognition impairment or people who are viewed as too young to consent and not able to appreciate the risks involved. So just because we may view them initially as a vulnerable person does not mean that that vulnerability has to be a barrier, that they as an autonomous person have the ability to consent on their own behalf for their own well-being. The second concern that we have is a concern for welfare. So in the first case, this is that balance of risk and benefit that we discussed earlier, that harms to the individual or the groups or the society through which the research process or its results will be at the best mitigated where we can foresee it. And any of those harms that we anticipate they can take on a number of different forms, and harm can be thought of in a number of different axes. You can think about the probability of the harm, whether it's a low probability or high probability, the magnitude of the harm, not very serious all the way to being significantly serious. But harm should also be thought of in a very broad conception. It's not just that we're going around electrically shocking our participants with physical or bodily harm, but we need to think about harm in terms of social harm, so social standing with your participants, harm to the community in ways stories being told, behavioral or psychological harm that comes out of participating in your study, even economic harm or the economic inducement to participate in your study. These must all be considered and balanced against the benefits of the study. Furthermore, you want to think about the participant's perspective. So in all aspects of the research, you want the participant's perspective and context to be considered. Their context will be things like their social, economic, and cultural position. And this also comes down to the transparency of the research itself. One of the pro tips that we give for our board members, and you can certainly use this yourself, when you're constructing your information letter, you should read it as if you are a participant. And we as a board, before we review your application itself, we will look at the informed consent letter and try to understand what the study is trying to get at without knowing any of the details of the scientific methodology behind it. And we find that that standpoint epistemology, to use a technical philosophical term, is really helpful for us to understand what you are asking of the participant and what you're asking for them to give to the study and what they can reasonably understand based on the information that you're presenting to them. So that is certainly a tip that you can use, is have somebody review the study's information letter and have them explain the study back to you to see whether or not you're explaining things properly or cleanly or clearly for your participant. The final bit under the concern for welfare is, of course, confidentiality and anonymity. We think of anonymity and confidentiality sometimes as the same thing, but one concerns more with how you protect the privacy versus their privacy to not be, their details not to be shared. And so the privacy of the participants, including any potential limitations, gets communicated, fully explained through the consent process. With the concern for justice, we want to think about equitable treatment. So all persons impacted by the research, they will be treated with equal respect and concern. The benefits of the research will be shared where feasible and with all those affected by the results. And we'll work into these two sections, concern for justice and respect for community. We'll put a pin in these ideas because our stumbling blocks are going to circle back to some of the implication that spills out of these. Next, for concern for justice, we think about the appropriate inclusion. So individuals or groups will not be excluded from the research for reasons unrelated to the research. So, for example, their gender, their race, their ethnicity, their age, their disability. So in this case, if it's not in line with your research question, you have to give serious consideration in terms of why you're choosing to exclude people from your study. It's not because it's inconvenient for the data sample, but that your research question informs who gets included and who doesn't get included. The final element under a concern for justice is the idea of power, that researchers will be cognizant of, and they'll work to mitigate the imbalances that exist in the power between themselves and the participant, or among individual participants themselves, or between participants, and even the power imbalance between the researcher as an outsider in some cases to the group itself of which they belong, or the participants that they belong. So these three guiding principles are given to us through the Tri-Council's policy statement on how research projects are guided in Canada. And then in the new version of TCPS, we suspect that there's going to be more emphasis placed on community. But as of right now, as of filming this webinar, we at CREO are thinking about things in terms of how the research is going to impact the community and how we can inform the research methodology from that community perspective. So one of the things we look at is the understanding of the community. So researchers will seek to understand and include relevant geographic or organizational / communities, and the communities, the best interests that relate to the research. And so oftentimes, especially under a Western research framework, the researcher is a dispassionate outsider who often parachutes into a community of people, and they view the community as an object. And so in this case, we're looking to flip that around a little bit so that the researcher starts the research process with an understanding of the interests and the priorities of the community itself. And so with that comes a respect for the community, that researchers will learn about and respect the community's culture, their traditions, their customs, their codes of conduct through the development of respectful relationships, collaboration, and engagement where appropriate. And again, I'm going to put a pin in that because we're going to circle back to that with stumbling block number 3 in terms of how we can start to think about that. One of the common phrases is the idea of decolonizing research, and I think that this really starts to build that, or at least take that framework under consideration in terms of how we build respect for community and how we move out of a Western research framework into something that's a little bit more inclusive towards community practice. And the final bit I want to say under here for respect for community is that idea of community inclusion. So communities and groups that are relevant or likely to be affected by the research, that they will be included in the shaping of the research and benefiting from its results. And again, that starts to break down that insider-outsider standpoint of how we construct these projects and how the research question gets informed. And so in this case, we're looking at the community being, if not the originator of the research project, then certainly a driver of the priorities of that research project. Well, that provides us a high-level set of guiding principles that when we review projects, it informs how we view the applications and how we view the studies. And so if you follow these guiding principles, you're going to be most of the way there. And so now I'd like to move on to some common stumbling blocks that we experience from a board level that, and I'm not saying that these are common stumbling blocks that you should have anticipated ahead of time, but these are things that when you don't think about some of the downstream effects of your research project, it tends to really open you up to some potential issues. So the first one I want to talk about is this idea of downstream inclusion. And I'd like to tell you a little bit of a story of one of the projects that I have reviewed that made me think about this. So a couple of years ago, I was reviewing a project, and it was a well-designed project. The aim was for the researchers to interview members of immigrant populations, and they wanted to understand how the members of the immigrant populations use their economic power to make decisions about health and nutrition. So uh, buying groceries and how they end up thinking about health. Really great study, really fantastic, really well-intentioned researchers. One thing I noticed was that when I was reviewing the materials, all of the material that came to us was in English. And so I asked the researchers, what plans do you have for having language specific consent processes in place? And the researcher gave a very reasonable response that unfortunately, under the funding, the budget doesn't really allow for us to contract outside organizations to provide translation services for us. And so we don't really have any plans to address this concretely. That's a completely reasonable initial response to that. But here's the ethical problem that we found when we were thinking about this is that if you provide a study where it collects information from only English speaking or people who are dual language, but the responses are given in English, that means that all of the data that you collect is going to be informed by only the participants who could respond to it. And if there's any policy implication that comes out of it, the policies are going to be uniformly applied to both the English speaking people that were participating in the study, as well as the non English speaking people in the study. And you have to remember that an organization who conducts the research, so your organization, you don't really speak on behalf of the community. And so when you think about the downstream inclusion of your research, it's important to understand whose ideas are going to get represented in the study and how does that information get conveyed. Or if you want to flip it around the other way, you can think about it in terms of whose voices are going to be missing and whether or not that's going to say something important about the research. And so the first stumbling block that I want you to consider is when you set up your data collection, when you start to understand the narratives that are coming out of the data, when you start to generate your analyses and it informs the conclusions of the study, oftentimes that the boxes that you choose to draw around the data will then get applied to people on a much larger scale. And so that there are often some downstream issues based on the project if you don't think about inclusion right from the outset. Now, the second stumbling block that I want to talk to you about is the idea of data versus stories. And I will admit that in the webinar up until this point, I have cashed things out in terms of data. And Western understandings of research tends to focus around the idea of data, a very depersonalized process, a very arm's length objective view of it. We tend to think about research in terms of data, but what I challenge you to think about is instead of thinking about collecting data, I want you to start to think about it in terms of collecting stories, that you are engaging meaningfully with people, either individuals or members of a community in general. And when you start to think about it in terms of stories, you start to think about it with a level of responsibility of you as the researcher, that you have to ensure that you're thinking about open transparency, that you're breaking down barriers to access, whether or not your participants incur any costs to come to you to tell you their story, whether or not you're stripping the language down so it's very clear and understandable to a wide audience, that you have as a researcher an emphasis on privacy. Because remember, when we're telling stories, uh, or at least if we frame it in terms of telling stories, we remove that idea that researchers are outsiders who end up getting parachuted into the community to study it as an object. And so when we think about it in terms of stories, we can understand how the community story gets told and how they shape their own narrative. So we want to reflect and ensure that we're thinking about how the priorities of the community gets emphasized in the research. And I think that shifting away from thinking about it in terms of data, in terms of story, helps you to think about it in these terms. Because if you look at the history of Western frameworks, we have historically uh, erased entire people's narratives in our quest to categorize the world. I mean, even if you look at a geographic map, you tend to find that it's broken up in terms of how we've chosen to outline the boundaries that doesn't necessarily reflect the peoples and the communities that are living in that area. And that's just a little bit of a metaphor, but this idea extends well into different kinds of research, that the research and the conclusions that are being drawn shapes the narrative. And we see this still going on today if you look at how stories erase things and how the stories get perpetuated in social media and media itself. It drives certain kinds of narratives and it tends to erase people's stories. And so that shift away from data allows you to think about people in terms of stories. And it starts to get you towards that idea of creating a common foundation with other principles in community-based research. Your research will be reciprocal in nature, that everyone can benefit from it, from the stories being shared, that there is a commitment to justice, that when you conduct the research, everyone's going to benefit from it, not just whomever benefits from the research in a global sense, but the community gives you their stories so that you can then make life better for them. That there's a relationship being drawn between the researcher and the community. That the research is done through collaboration and respectful relationships among people. But most importantly, that it's community informed. It's not depersonalized data, but it's people telling their stories, and that the people of the community can inform the research practice itself. This also touches on the idea of data ownership, which brings me to stumbling block number 3 in terms of who owns the data. And here I have, there's 2 links here on the slide. So when you have the PDF, it'll take you to these news articles. But this is something that, I mean, if you're used to a community-based framework, you've probably also already started thinking about data ownership. But the, the way we think of research in the Western culture tends to be that often the principal investigator becomes the owner. Because they're doing the intellectual work of the project, they often are the ones who own the data. Or if it's not the researcher, then often it's the institution, and they own the intellectual property, usually because it's their funding, their resources, their personnel. And we have to take seriously what data ownership means, because you can have data ownership in terms of the raw material that's being collected from the research participants, say if you take biological samples, or the intellectual ownership of the ideas, both the ideas that get conveyed to you as a researcher, as well as the way the stories get told afterwards. And if the researcher is the one who's telling the story without the community having ownership over that, then the researcher is the one who ends up taking control of the narrative. So the specific story that I'm referencing in the articles here involves a researcher by the name of Rick Ward, who did some research in the 80s on Vancouver Island with a few of the local tribes. And his initial research, or at least the initial framework of the research, seemed to be all on the up and up. There was no real concerns initially. He was going around collecting blood samples from members of the community, looking for, or with an eye towards addressing arthritis. And so things were going all right, but then around, say, 86, I believe it was, Rick Ward had left UBC, where he was originally an employee, and he took the blood samples with him to his new job at the University of Utah, and then eventually in the mid-90s, he found his way to Oxford. And what we see in this example is, and this is where members of the tribe started to learn about it based on publications. So they had lost ownership over their data, over the biological material collected for the study. And they lost it in a bunch of different ways. So one, when Rick Ward took the biological samples with them, he certainly violated their community norms and beliefs about bodily autonomy. But also, he was doing things with the blood that had never been consented to in the first place. So he was taking blood samples and loaning them out to other researchers. He stopped doing, I guess the arthritis study turned out to not really yield any good results. And so he started using the blood for other purposes. And they started doing some ethnographic and anthropological work, and they were publishing information about Indigenous people's movements through the continent upwards of 40,000 years ago, keeping in mind that cultural artifacts only go back maybe about 4,000 years. And so Ward was benefiting directly from the repurposing the study, and there was absolutely no benefit or considerations given back to the community in terms of how the data was used and how the material was supposed to be stewarded. And so when we think about data ownership, we really want to take serious what this means in terms of the data that we collect or the stories that we collect and what we do with it and who ultimately owns it, which is why we often look to have that community-based research framework in there, that the community is the one who's informing the research and informing the research questions itself. And a number of good initiatives have come up in response to these kinds of cases. So the principles of OCAP for Indigenous research, so ownership, control, access, and possession, is something now that is incredibly important to build into the project from a foundational level. And this problem is only going to get worse because the way that research is being funded and the way it's moving more towards an open model or open access model of holding onto data. So you collect your study data, you synthesize it, maybe you depersonalize it, but then once you publish, you take the raw data, maybe it's been stripped of all identifiers, and then for universities and hospitals and healthcare settings and whatnot, that data is encouraged to be put into long-term storage solutions so that other researchers have the ability to cross-link the data in order to discover new knowledge. And so if you don't think about ownership right from the outset in terms of how you get your participants to consent to it, you will run into problems of downstream problems where the data that's being collected is not being used for the purposes that the person had originally consented for. Now, this brings us to a different issue, which is the idea of, and stumbling block number 4, the ongoing informed consent process. So, just because your research project is modified, or just because that there are emerging properties in it, doesn't mean that that's the end of the data's life, or that's the end of the life of the stories. You can go back and get further consent or reaffirm the consent for new purposes and allow people to make decisions for themselves. And here's an example that I wanted to use to illustrate this. And I chose intentionally a man reading a newspaper here, and that is media coverage. So in the last year, I reviewed an application, and the project itself was concerning a very small percentage of the population. And the problems that it was looking to address became a political issue. The priorities of the government had shifted, and so more attention was being given to organizations working in this area. And so the researchers were being contacted by the media. And when you think about it, researchers can be advocates for these social issues, but the media was looking to talk to researchers, talk to them about the work that they're doing. And when it's discovered that they are working on research projects, maybe they can contact the research participants to have them share their story. And the researchers, thankfully, they had the foresight to say, hang on a second, this is a serious issue. And so they got back in touch with us to give us transparently, this is what's being asked of us. What should we do, or how should we think about it? And really, you have to think about it from the participant's point of view. That standpoint epistemology that I referenced earlier in the webinar, if you put yourself in the shoes of the participant and you understand what was asked of them, the research project was bounded in a certain way, that I, as a participant, will participate under these conditions. The research will take the data that's collected from that, use it in this way, and potentially report on it in a certain way. And those were the boundaries that were agreed upon in the initial review or the initial consultation with your participant. But media attention is something that's really hard to anticipate ahead of time. And so if I didn't go into it as a participant, if I didn't go into this, it's almost like a contract, but if I didn't agree to the terms of the study with the understanding that participating in this brings in the possibility of my privacy being infringed upon because more attention is being brought to the study, then you haven't really had a good informed consent process. And when I say this, like perhaps I'm conflating a couple issues. It's not that the original consent process had any issues with it. It's just that the new consent process, or at least the study as it's conceived now, has to now integrate that new level of risk involved. That if you're participating in this study, it does bring with it different kinds of risks. And so, really, what you need to do when you think about the consent process is that it has to be an ongoing informed consent process. And anytime there's a material change in the study where how you deal with the data or how you respond to the participants changes, it's always important that you're going to have to go back and reaffirm that consent that they gave to you. The final stumbling block, now this is going to be a little bit more amorphous, and it's the idea of data stewardship. And this is really a change that is coming about because technology changes at a very rapid rate. We are in basically an era of unsecured connections in big data mining. So the more that technology advances, the harder it becomes to have good data stewardship or good data management. And this is something that the TCPS and the Tri-Council is moving towards in terms of responsible research, of having researchers think very intentionally about how they safeguard the data, safeguard those stories, and how they respect privacy. And unfortunately, the tools that you as researchers are using are often going to be subject to end user agreements where you don't actually necessarily control the entire process. And so lots of things can pop up through user error or through broken systems. I mean, I myself, just as an example, I was one of the students whose OSAP data was lost by the federal government, I believe, in the 2000 to 2006 era. And so I had my potential privacy affected because somebody misplaced a hard drive. And when we think about data and when we think about the inconvenience, I mean, when my data is lost, it's going to probably be inconvenient. But when somebody else's privacy is breached, it can have lasting harm to them. So, or if you think about it in terms of big data, when my data gets mined, more often than not, it usually means that I will get better targeted ads to me, that the internet will be better catering to my whims as a user. But when somebody else's data gets mined, things like their skin color will start to prevent them from accessing things like affordable housing. So how this data gets used and how the data is shared becomes a really tricky issue. And I'll give you one more consideration before we start to move towards the close. An example of this is SurveyMonkey. SurveyMonkey is a fantastic tool. It's very easy. It's very inexpensive, even at the basic level. And it allows you to collect data, and it allows you to collect it from a wide group of people. It solves all kinds of logistical problems. The problem is SurveyMonkey is a company based out of the United States. And while the internet is a global thing, the infrastructure that it sits on is unfortunately geographically limiting. And so when you as a participant, or sorry, when you as a researcher ask participants to include their data on the SurveyMonkey platform, that data gets transmitted to the United States to the servers that are housed there, which means that the data is then subject to the Patriot Act, which means that it is subject to snooping by anybody who has access through the Patriot Act. Now, this might not be an issue, if it's depersonalized data, what kind of harm can come out of it? Well, there's lots of potential avenues for harm. One, IP addresses are tracked, and so it's easy to trace that information back to the users. Likewise, the content, what kinds of questions you're asking may start to matter. In Canada, we've recently decriminalized cannabis use, and so if you're asking questions about drug use and whatnot, that can be snooped on in the States. And we know that Canadians are being turned away at the border for legal cannabis use. And so the things that you're asking them and the tools that you're using might not be ensuring their privacy when they participate in your study. And so sometimes you can mitigate that by choosing good research tools. And sometimes that just means that you have to be very transparent in terms of how you're going to end up using the data and what the limitations of that data is. So it forces you to think about the collection, the recording, the transmission, the local and cloud storage of the device, the access to the information, the analysis of the information, the dissemination of the information, and ultimately where it gets deposited, whether it's destroyed or put into long-term use. So remember, if we think about it in terms of stories and we want to think about good data stewardship, people and communities are trusting you with their stories, and so you have an obligation to seriously think through these issues. Now, I've thrown a lot of information at you, so let's bring this to a bit of a close. So, in summary, when it comes to research ethics as praxis, the best practice for you is to try to build ethics into the foundation of your study. And you can do this by following the guiding principles that TCPS gives us and respect for communities as we do with CREO. But also you want to make sure that you consider the downstream effects of your projects, what kind of impacts it'll have based on the stories you tell. And remember, you're dealing with people, you're not dealing with data points. You need to stop depersonalizing it for the sake of your data analysis, but you are dealing with people and communities that have priorities and have their own intentions and have their own desires for their own future well-being. You want to make sure that you reflect on what ownership means over the lifetime of the project. Not only the data that you collect, but what happens to the data once it gets published. You want to make sure that consent is always going to be ongoing and it's reaffirmed and reaffirmed and reaffirmed at every stage that it requires it. And finally, you want to make sure that you protect your participants through good data stewardship, through good data management. So I will now pause. If there are any questions, I open it up. I hope that we get some good discussion.
Thank you for that interesting presentation, Ryan. Just to let the audience know, a recorded version of this webinar, as well as the slides, will be available on the website under resources. So we will go into our question and answer period. Please feel free to type out your answers and, your questions, and we'll get right to it. We're waiting for those questions to come up. I just want to suggest ways that you can get more involved with CBRC. We welcome you to become a member of CBRC through your institution, organization, as an individual, faculty, or student. You can continue to join us for our webinars. There are 2 more coming up, one in June and one in July, so you can go to our website to register for those. If you are a community-based researcher, you can join the network map by submitting your profile on the CBRC website. You can send your news and events from your organization to info@communityresearchcanada.ca, and I will share them on the CBRC website. Or you can also sign up for the CBRC mailing list by going to the newsletter page and entering your email address. I guess people are still kind of generating their questions. So a question I have for you in the meantime is, does every research project need ethics approval?
So under the TCPS framework, not every research project requires ethics approval. The attitude that we take at CREO is that just because it doesn't fall under certain definitions of research or certain kinds of research doesn't mean that the process of looking at the ethics is necessarily going to be something that the project will benefit from. So under TCPS, there are a couple research project types that usually don't require ethics approval. Anything where you're using secondary uses of data that's publicly available typically doesn't require it. And things like observational studies. So if I go sit out in a park and I collect information about human movement patterns, but I'm not describing anything about the person, typically that won't require it as well. Oftentimes, research done in the context of education, so your class doing a research project, oftentimes doesn't necessarily require it, but it's always good for the institution to review it. And program review. Oftentimes, a lot of the projects that you do as a community organization will be reviewing the service that you provide to participants in terms of whether or not the resources are being properly allocated. And technically, by TCPS's standards, those do not fall under the realm of research. But like I said, when it comes to research, these ideas are all good ideas that it's worthwhile to reflect on them to ensure that you're thinking through the ethical implications of what you're asking of your participants in order to help inform your process. So the long answer was that. The shorter answer is reach out to the REB, whomever it is, and see whether or not it's something we need to worry about.
Great, that's really helpful to know. Looks like we have a couple other questions down there.
Right, I see
Um,
one. Joe, I wonder if you could say something about your institute, how your institute reflects on well-being of researchers during fieldwork. Often community work involves sensitive, emotive issues raised by participants. Yes, this is something, oftentimes you get so fixated on the participants that you can very easily forget that there are also people conducting the research. And we have had this, and it has manifested itself in a couple of ways. One where people are going out into the community, and I'm just going to give an example here, people going out into the community to survey people who are habitual drug users. And so anything that comes out of safety concerns for their well-being. Now, these are organizations that work with the population, so there's a certain level of trust that we have in their own operations, but we do push back on it in terms of whether or not there's ways of you mitigating this so that your researchers or research assistants aren't exposing themselves to harm and risk. But also here, your question is well taken that when you're asking very difficult questions and you're approaching things from emotional harm or the harm that comes out of emotionally exposing yourself, it is incredibly hard to anticipate what the research assistant, who's oftentimes a professional, how they're going to respond to this process. One of the things that we often ask is for the researchers to ensure that they have resources available, whether it's just an information sheet on people that the participants can contact if they need to follow up, if there's any lasting thought processes or any kind of emotional harm that comes out of it, that here are some resources that we've set up that you can avail yourself of. But the same can be applied to the researcher to ensure that those processes are in place to ensure adequate debriefing is happening and that researchers have somebody that they can check in with to ensure that when we're dealing with these really difficult questions that they are also supported, not just the researchers. And yes, researchers are often not trained in managing these issues. We do ask what kinds of training is being available, but yeah, there's only so far that preparation can take you. So we try to get as far as we can, and we can make recommendations on how to approach this, but it is certainly an ongoing issue. Let's see, Joanna, how does Creo work? Is there anything special or different than using ERBs? Well, Creo is different in the sense that we are not tied to an institution. Normally, with an REB, it's a part of a college, a university, or a hospital, and the REB is a arm's distance group of people, but they're usually employees of the institution, so they are accountable to that institution, and the researchers conducting the research are accountable to that institution. Creo's a little different. We are more like a consulting group than your traditional IRB, REB, whatever. And so we use the TCPS as our framework. So we aren't making this up on our own. We are using the best practices that are used by researchers across Canada, and we use that to review the applications. And then we review it for ethical soundness. And then as long as the researchers are abiding by what they say they do, then we consider the project to be sound. So that's the way in which Creo is a little bit different from a traditional REB. Who can apply to Creo? Anyone. In terms of an application, anyone. We've had applications from graduate students who are doing work. Well, say a graduate student with a university outside of Canada, but they are a Canadian citizen who are doing work inside of Canada, and they're looking for a local REB to be sensitive to issues involving Canadians. So we've had that. We've had nonprofits from across Canada. We've had local organizations. So we do try to provide services as widely as we can. So really, we will be transparent in terms of who we can help. We do have some limitations. We don't have medical expertise, so we can't do clinical reviews. Um, and at special circumstances, we would have to look at on at a case by case basis. But if you are interested or you are curious about it, you can certainly contact us if you have any questions. Matthew, data stewardship really stood out for me. Survey monkey we discussed. What are some of the challenges? specific software. In the application, we will ask people to list what kinds of tools they're using, and more often than not, these are going to be the questions that or the parts of the application that I will send back a lot of questions about. And I try to get very nitty gritty about it. You say you're going to be doing an interview. Are you recording the interview? If you're going to record it, what are you recording it on? Are you recording it on a cell phone? Does that cell phone automatically back up to a cloud? Or are you purchasing a dummy device that does an audio tape? When you transfer that audio to your computer, are you putting it onto your computer locally, or is it being synced into the cloud? How do you password protect the computer? How do you encrypt the data? So I do go through and ask a lot of these questions. And at my other ethics board at Conestoga College, we are trying to develop some best practice sheets that the researchers can use, because within an institution, there's a lot of resources that can be put behind the researchers in order to ensure that they have those tools in place, and those tools are well designed. So instead of using SurveyMonkey, they use Qualtrics. Instead of using Dropbox or Google Drive, they use SharePoint with Canadian servers. But those resource limitations are very real realities for community organizations. And so we do try to work through and understand the implications of the technology use. But ultimately, we have to remember that we're never going to be able to completely eliminate all risk. I mean, if we ever take that as a starting position, that's our goal, we are going to fail. We are going to inevitably miss something. And it's important to understand that limitation. And the thing about the informed consent process is that you lay it out for your participant, and the participant makes a decision based on their own interests, whether or not it's a level of risk that they are willing to take. Remember, when I said research and knowledge pushes the boundaries of what we know, and so that comes with risk. And advances in medicine, while it does have a very dark history, it also is a history of people taking chances on things and determining what works and what doesn't work. And so people in the informed consent process have to make that determination for themselves. And you as a researcher have an obligation to identify those risks ahead of time and say, given this is what the study is, this is what we are doing, these are the risks. Are these risks acceptable to you? And if not, you can go ahead and walk away, and there's no hard feelings about it. So that's why I said data stewardship, data management, it's amorphous, and it's really something that's just, it's a shifting goalpost, or moving, the ground is shifting sand underneath you. Any metaphor that you want to use, it's incredibly difficult because technology is always keeping itself one step ahead of the researchers, and probably 2 steps ahead of your budget.
Thanks, everyone, for the questions. Please take 2 minutes after this webinar to share your feedback on a page that will pop up shortly. We appreciate your feedback so that we can give you more relevant and quality community-based research programming. On behalf of Community-Based Research Canada, I would like to thank Ryan for the wonderful presentation. And thank you all for joining us today. I hope to see you again soon in June or July.
Thanks, bye.
Thank you.